making sense of God. There's a verse in Psalms, "Taste and see that the Lord is good. Happy is the man who takes refuge in him." Psalm 34, verse 9. We're all familiar with the idea that we have five senses: sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell. Some would add a sixth sense, an intuitive or proprioceptive mode of interaction with the world. We're created by God in the image of God as a microcosm that mirrors the macrocosm of the Creator. So we would expect all of our senses to potentially afford us an experience of our Creator. Aside from poetic license, why do these two senses, taste and sight, get singled out to guide us into a good experience of God? Sight is primarily our access out into the world. We see and attempt to make sense of the world outside of us. Sight is an active or outgoing sense. We can, of course, be seen, both literally by others and in the sense of being revealed through our behaviors. Hearing is primarily how the world gets into us. Sound is an incoming sense, though of course we can be heard when we speak or make a noise through our actions. Sight requires that we look out into the world. It's also relatively easy to avert or to close our eyes. Sound comes into us. It takes more effort to block out sound from the outside than to block seeing. And even then, that's not always successful, since we can hear sound through bone conduction, even when the ears have been covered. Now we can see the link between the two words taste and see in the verse in Psalms. Both of those senses require more active participation or commitment on our part, and they are relatively easy to avoid if we so choose. Both hearing and smell are more receptive senses arriving in our bodies without our choosing and are relatively more difficult to avoid. Modern Western science considers that human taste receptors in the mouth can differentiate 5 basic tastes: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and savory. If we can taste God, as the psalm suggests, could any and all of these be considered a way of knowing God? What is the taste that we would describe as good? So what does God taste like? That might depend on how we experience ourselves on any particular day. We might wake up feeling secure in body and mind, at peace with our significant relationships, our finances, and our health. On that day, life tastes sweet. Our prayers flow easily without distraction, and our thoughts are light and joyful. On a different day, we might, God forbid, be in pain in our body, concerned about our finances, worried about some of our relationships, or confused about our dialogue with God. On that day, we might complain to ourselves and to others that life tastes bitter. Or life might seem to us rich and full and substantial. Then we might say on that day, our taste of life is savory. When life is sweet, it's easier to say God is good. When our situations are really tough and we experience doubt or disappointment, it's not always easy to proclaim that God is good. Few people live continually only in one state or the other. Through the passage of their lives, most individuals experience some time of sweet ease and other times of bitter disappointment, albeit in different amounts. How can we make sense of these opposites? Can we also taste that God is good when our situation is bitter or salty or sour? Is it possible to turn an unpleasant sense of existence into a kinder one, a bitter taste transformed into sweetness? That bitterness needs to be transformed into sweetness is a fundamental idea in many rabbinic and other teachings. The Zohar speaks of the need for mankind to wake up and see and to transform the darkness into light and the bitterness into sweet. Here again, the two senses used are sight and taste. For this to be accomplished, we have to apply ourselves. Simply thinking about the matter or waiting for it to happen will not achieve the desired result. To attain sweetness and well-being, there must first be bitterness, or there is nothing to transform. For the salt of bitterness to turn into the salt of wisdom, as Jung and the alchemists say, there needs first to be salt. which means that the suffering and the bitter situations we might sometimes find ourselves in and the unpleasant realizations we may have are necessary. They are the very source of the blessing and sweetness that later follow if we're able to transform those sharp times. So we need to know where the salt mines are, where to find the source of the bitterness. And here the rabbis, the alchemists, and the philosophers all agree. The source of the salt is inside oneself. Blood, sweat, tears, and urine all contain salt. Thus, we can understand the efforts we put into demanding self-examination at any time, but especially at Rosh Hashanah, when we dedicate 10 days to honest introspection. The flow of imagery that accompanies the intense emotion, the bittersweet crystallization of our essential nature, when we apply ourselves to challenge our habitual behaviors, and the anxiety and feelings of weakness we might have when confronting our own shortcomings, all these are the salt mines. We usually refer to salt as common salt, not in the sense of being commonplace or cheap, but because these experiences are shared by all. We all have some moments, perhaps righteously, of feeling bitter about the way we have been treated by others or by life. And we all have some behaviors that, looked at closely, burn us with embarrassment. This is what the salt of the earth means when we speak of our common humanity. This inner work and self-examination produces the bitter and fiery substance of recognizing ourselves if we persevere, and with God's blessing, we gain insight into things just as they are, that we are just as we are, that this is our fate. It is not the outside world that needs to change. It is our own attitude that needs revisioning. What we realize is our place in the world where we are impacted by forces greater than ourselves, where the phrase God-given destiny is not an inflation, but a humbling insight that is hard-won and behaved with humility. With that realization, these same bitter experiences and insights can transform into the sweet waters of self-acceptance and self-worth. Regarding the emotions experienced during this transformation, Carl Jung writes, bitterness and wisdom form a pair of opposites with a third thing in between. The factor common to both, however incommensurable the two ideas may seem, psychologically, is the function of feeling. Tears, sorrow, and disappointment are bitter, but wisdom is the comforter of all psychic suffering. There is a caution here. Just as with food, too little salt leaves the meal bland, and too much salt makes a dish unpalatable. Salt, which is bitter by itself, when used in the correct proportion, brings out a hidden flavor of the food and is no longer bitter. So with our extracting our inner salt through self-examination, too little leaves us uninteresting and tasteless, even to ourselves, while too much makes us bitter and without joy. Understanding that it is God's hand that directs everything, we become reconciled with our fate and our perspective changes. Moving from out there, literal and discontinuous, to the psychic, inner and eternal is the work of making soul. The taste of honey redeems the bitter taste of salt. Because they share an essential nature of deepening events into insight, they can substitute for each other. The memory of Rosh Hashanah on the tongue is sweet, yet the source of that sweetness is the salt of the events, including awareness of the errors of the preceding year, now confidently transformed into a blessing. The honey of Rosh Hashanah carries the same obligation of community, dignity, and support that are part of the meal hospitality of salt. That is the promise of a healing renewal of Rosh Hashanah, where we are afforded each year the opportunity of starting over. We taste and see the honey. Our past mistakes are nullified. What was done and what we did is remembered, forgiven, and transformed. And we draw close to God, and God comes close to us. And this sweetens any bitterness and brings about an ease to our suffering. And we can taste and see that God is good.